I call this workshop Heads and Tails, and I have a little dictionary definition at the bottom. And the dictionary definition of this idiom tells us that this is really used in the negative, in the sense that, when one is really very frustrated trying to understand or make sense of something, one says, oh, I don't understand head or tail of it. I can't make head or tail of it. Whether that is a whole bunch of research work that we have done, and there's so much material and we don't know how to string it together so that it makes sense, or any other work that we are doing where we have collected a whole lot of information, but we don't know what to do with it, right? And we live in the age of big data. Like collecting information and collecting data doesn't seem to be a problem. The point is then, how do we make head or tail of it? And having made head or tail of it, or is there only one way to make head or tail of it? So I will focus today on this idea that when we do research, we think about presenting research in a way that is acceptable as appropriate to it. And what is considered appropriate to research is presenting it in the form of an essay, right? And it could be an article in a journal, it could be a book chapter, it could be a book. If you've done research, then that's the kind of work that you do. In fact, a part of the CAS, you all did some research and you all actually produced video essays, video documentaries and video essays. And those are all genres of nonfiction, right? You can write a journalistic essay, you can write an academic essay, you can write a video essay, you can make a photo essay. These are all genres of nonfiction. And, the process that seems very logical, that if you are doing research work, and what do you do when you do research work? You kind of find a topic. In fact, as a part of CAS, you were allowed to pick your own topic, right? So you picked your own topic, then you kind of worked around with a research question, then you read up on it, books, articles, online, or in one of the fabulous libraries that your school has. Or sometimes maybe you went out to the site, if depending on what your topic was, and you did some interviews or you made some notes, right? So these are the things that we do. The point is, after we have collected all those notes, all those interviews, all those summaries from sources that we've read, then what, right? And the then what seems to be, okay, then you write an essay. But even when you're writing an essay, how do you gather what you want to say about it? And that preliminary work you have already done. So I'm not going to get into it. If this was an academic writing workshop, I would have gone into that. But I won't today, because Kanika actually shared one of the video projects from the ones that you made. So I already know that part you have covered at some level. So I won't get into that. What I will get into today is that the only way to present our research to our audiences? And I'm deliberately saying audiences, because audiences, when you have video essay, it's a very different way of reading and interpreting that, right? So or is there some other way? Is there some other way to do this? And very specifically, as the title of my talk also talks about, can we use fiction to present research? Now, typically we would say that, well, these are two different things, right? Fiction is all made up. You make up a story, you make up things, and you go along as you write a story. Now, isn't that exactly the opposite of research? So turns out, when we think about research and its presentation, we think about presenting a certain phenomenon or certain social reality, and the genres, different genres of nonfiction allow us to do that without anyone questioning any facts or details from it. But what happens when we maybe also convey the results of our research via fiction? Now, is that even done? Is that even a thing? Is it even a possibility, right? So what I'm going to do is, instead of trying to convince you just by saying people do it, I'll take you to an example. And what I'd like you to do, so this is one of the two PDFs that you have. So keep it open, and I will take you through this, then I'll take you through the PDF as well. But before I change my screen sharing, just broadly, I want to make a few points. So this PDF, and you have another PDF as well, if you just scroll through it up and down, you don't have to read it, but if you just, what I have here are screenshots from 3 different portions of that PDF. May I have some responses about what that makes you think? Just browsing as you scroll up and down from the first page to the last, what do you notice about the PDF?
So I've just, glanced through it.
Yes.
And there's a lot of detail.
Mm-hmm.
And after a point, I mean, unless I were forced to read it, I wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of a Tom Clancy novel where he spends like 100 pages describing a missile head.
Okay, very good. So details, scrolling up, and it's all black and white, by the way. And you scroll up and down, and what your eyes sort of fall on is that there's a whole bunch of detail. What kind of details is it?
So it talks about ethno-archaeological, work, which is to do with observation, and the other, which is experimental. So I just, got.
Just look. So there are maps, there are figures, there are page numbers, there are tables, and there's documentation of different kinds of.
Absolutely.
Okay. Would you agree that's what's going on?
Yes, citations and all of that. Yes.
And the last page is full of what that person has read in the library, right?
You said my point later when you were speaking, but I saw that there was a lot of information represented through graphs and tables and statistics. So that's what I noticed while I was going through the PDF.
Excellent. What is the title of this article? Where does it appear? What does it appear in a book? Can you tell where it appears?
It seems to be a journal.
Yes. Yes, it's a scholarly journal. It's a journal article. It appears in a journal. What's the title of the journal?
Work of archaeologists. No.
This is it's there on the screen.
Indian historical.
So there are 2 different journals, right? So this is Indian historical research, and the title of this essay, this research paper, is "Children Playing and Learning: Crafting Ceramics in Ancient Indoor Khera." And this is the work of a friend of mine called Jaya Menon, who is a professor of archaeology at Shivnadar University, where I used to teach and where Arpan used to teach, as well as how we met and got to know each other. So this is her work. When archaeologists do their work and present it to the community of scholars, this is what it looks like. I wanted you to get a sense for what a research paper, which is non-fiction, looks like, right? So you've noticed some of the features already, and you don't feel terribly encouraged to read it. Unless you have to, you're like, okay, it's not exactly grabbing my attention, right? Next, I also shared a link with you, a link to a story. Does everybody have the link? Shantan, put it in the chat again, please. If you go on the link, you're going to see this. Do you see this? Browsing, what is your impression and how is it different from browsing what you browse? What's the title?
A Home on the Hill.
You read the title, Home on the Hill, and you scroll down that. How, again, physically, just tangibly, just looking at it, how does it seem different? Or does it seem different from what?
Colorful.
There are colors in it. In fact, even the images are colorful, right? The images in the previous one weren't in color, they were in black and white.
It has paragraphs, shorter paragraphs. It's easier on the eye.
Yes, all of that. And what genre do you think this is? So that we said clearly looks like non-fiction research work presented with tables and footnotes and documentation and reporting. What genre do you think this might be? I'm just read the first line, waking up. Can I request one of you to read just the first sentence starting waking up on an early winter's day?
Waking up on an early winter's day, there's a clear view at this height, despite the wispy mist of the Choya rivulet across the fields of just planted wheat.
Okay, just that first sentence. What does that tell you about what genre you're going to now read? It's a narrative, right? It might be a story. It might actually be a story. So notice how this is by the same author, Jaya Menon. And this journal was something that I helped edit when I was a teacher at Shivnada University. And Jaya Menon, actually, this was the very first story she wrote, and I helped her write it and I helped her edit it. And so what I wanted to indicate here is that, here's like a solid, like full-time scholar, like, an academic who writes papers like this, who felt encouraged at some point to write a story with the help of the research material. And we'll get into the details of that in a minute, but I just wanted to show this to say that, yes, it is a thing. It is possible to actually present one's research work in more than one way. It is possible to present. Now, when we say we are making fiction out of our research work, what are we fictionalizing? What is it, and why are we fictionalizing it? That's the question that we would need to answer. So, so I just take you through this, and to say that if you notice right at the very beginning, they talk about, we were, and I'll just, just broadly take you through the text by saying we were writing chapters for ancient Indian history school textbooks, and colleagues asked us, and these are archaeologists, right? And these are archaeologists who work primarily with Harappan era sites that are, 2,000-3,000 years ago sites from that era, right? And so someone said, well, how come you don't talk about children? And they said, we've never encountered any evidence that allows us to think about children or what they were doing. And they realized it was partly because it never occurred to them as a question. And so when Jaya and Supriya, the two archaeologists who work in this site called Indoor Khera, and we will get into that also in a little bit, when they started doing that, they realized they saw something there. And that's the main argument of this article. So they go to, this is their excavation site, and they've given a map to tell you where Indoor Khera is. It's between Ganga and Yamuna. And they do this entire excavation, and as is required for their field, they give you all kinds of details about the excavation, the sites, and the chronology, when did they do what. This is something that they're required to do. They give you maps and figures to understand all of this. They give you scales. They describe very, very, in a very detailed way, what the excavation sites looked like, what they found. These are the rooms. This is what goes on. So they do all this description, and then they give you a list of things they find in the excavation site. And among the things that they find, and I want to bring your attention here, handmade objects possibly made by children, right? So they find these objects in the site that they wonder what these things are, and they come up with an argument. They come up with a thesis that are these things, that they've established that Indoor Khera is a site where potters work, that it was a potter's village that they were able to, and if you read the article, you'll see how they established it. So they find these objects, and their reading of that is that could it not, these are potter's village, children have to learn how to do it. Is it possible that these objects were that? And then they do a very close analysis of it, of toys. And again, you have the article, you can take a look at it, but this is what I wanted to draw your attention to. So these are the objects that they look at that don't look like the work of expertise. They've also found things that look very well made. So they look at all of this stuff and they speculate whether these were things their kids were making in play before they are getting trained in the skill of what potters learn to do. So this is what is the story version of much of the research material that you saw in the research. And that's not the only one. In fact, there is another article I've shared, which is about, and I won't take you through that, you can do it yourself. If you go through it, you'll see that that article is about technologies of pottery. How are they working with clay? What kind of mud was it? How were they baking it? What kind of technology did they have to shape those things? There's a very detailed analysis of the technology of pottery in that research essay. Now comes this story. And the question then is that, how does she take material that is basically their research work and cast it in a form that is different, something that Vatsal also pointed out that other writers have done, in a way that doesn't look like that intimidating research paper that we don't feel like reading, right? So may I request Shayantan to just read the text in the italics here, please.
Sure. In the middle of the plain between the Yamuna and the Ganges rivers is a village called Indoor Khera that sits atop what looks like a small hill. This hill is not natural, but is built up of deposits that are over 3,000 years ago. Roughly 2,000 years ago, this hill was much lower and had a small town perched on it. About 5 years ago, parts of this town were excavated, showing that a small and vibrant potters community lived on its extreme northwestern edge. Among the numerous objects found in the excavation were several misshapen tiny bowls. Below is a possible day in the life of that community based on the evidence that was recovered from the houses of those potters. What would it have been like to be a woman in Potter's household 2,000 years ago in Indoor Khera?
Okay, so Shayantan read out this bit of text. My question to all of you is, does this bit of text tell us what the point of the story might be, or why Jaya is choosing now to write this in the form of a story, having already published the research work and the research papers in academic journals?
Yeah, reach out to a wider audience, more varied audience.
Yes, reach out to a wider and varied audience. And what is the, so in one article, their argument is that, okay, so those misshapen things might be things that children are making. In another article, they detail the technology that was available to these potters 2,000 years ago and what skills they had in terms of producing them. Having done all of that, what is the point of this story, right? And here, below is a possible day in the life of the community based on the evidence. What might it have been like to be a woman in a potter's household 2,000 years ago in Indoor Khera? Now, as an archaeologist, and there's a picture, a photograph of the site, right? You can get all this evidence, but there's so much that you can't really tell. So you see, so I'm going to come to that question next, and I hope some of the students will participate in that. But briefly, I just wanted to draw your attention here. Why fiction? So clearly, on the basis of the evidence in the research, you can make one kind of claims. But fiction, which is an act of imagining also certain details and reality, might help you do something that a non-fiction research essay will not give you room to do. So imagining what might it be like to be a woman in a potter's household 2,000 years ago, you've got to imagine it. And you can imagine it maybe based closely on what you find, but certain details you're just making up. There is no, and so we'll think about what those details are that actually then maybe bring this to a wider audience. Right? So I just quickly want to scroll through this. You have this story. We read the very first sentence. We look at a few other things. Right away, we notice who is the protagonist here. May I request Neha to actually read this entire first paragraph, please? Yeah, and sure. As she reads it, may I request the workshop participants to imagine this protagonist, right? I'll ask you some questions about that. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Waking up on an early winter's day, there is a clear view at this height, despite the wispy mist, of the Choya rivulet across the fields of just planted wheat. On its bank is a little clearing in the fields where the temple sits. Today, there is no time to go to the temple as the day's work looms ahead. A large consignment of vessels have to be prepared and taken to the market in a nearby town. Before anything else, I have to first get water from the river. For this, I take the path down to the base and wonder for the nth time why we have to live on top of this mount. There are no natural hills in this region, so what is this hill on which our village is located? The old men in the town say that there was an ancient place here much earlier, and then an earthquake came and turned everything upside down. All I know is that the children keep digging up beads, bangles, and sometimes coins. I don't understand these, as we don't use such coins now, but then it is metal and we can melt them down to make jewelry.
Thank you so much, Neha. So just reading this paragraph, what does it tell you about the protagonist? Some features you can think of. What can we tell? Who is this protagonist?
Young girl.
She's a woman.
Right away, we figure that it's a woman, and possibly not too old, possibly
young.
Yes. A young woman. What else? Anything else?
Hard life,
a lot to do.
Hard life. There are lots of chores, climbing up and down a mountain.
Yes. So no modern conveniences.
2000 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so not much leisure time and a lot of work to do.
A lot of work. May I request now one of the SBS students to read out this paragraph, coming back up to the house.
Coming back to the house, I stop a bit at Shanti's door to chat with her. Shanti also lives in a potter's house and has much the same work as I do. 2 days ago, we had gone together to the nearby pond to collect the clay from its banks. I see her husband is already at work, and so I tear myself away since I have to get a large batch of clay prepared. The clay heap is in a corner of the courtyard, and I take a portion of it. Beating the clay nodules into a fine powder with a wooden bat is hard work, but without that, clay cannot be prepared. I usually have my husband's sister helping me with this, but today she had to go to our ancestral village, so I do it alone. While beating, I continuously sort the clay till it is evenly fine. Then I make a well in the heap and mix water into it and knead it into a lump. After making several lumps, I let them rest under a damp cloth to prevent them from drying.
Thank you so much, Suryansh. Now, a few other details have been added here. Which bits do you think came from the research and would be a part of the research? And which bits do you think are fictional and have been made up?
Yeah, the fact that there were lots of people doing the same occupation.
Is what?
That's pottery.
That's fact.
So that's fact, and that would probably come from
the community of potters.
Yes. What else would come from the research and what's made up?
So all the technical aspects of kneading the clay and evening it out and all
Beating
of that.
it and
Yes. So all of that would be part of the research. So what's the fictional part here? Between the first two paragraphs, what's the made up stuff? What else is definitely made up?
Stopping at her friend's house.
First of all, Shanti is the name of the friend. We don't actually have the name of the protagonist. The protagonist is made up. The protagonist friend has a name, Shanti.
That's made up.
Shanti is made up, right? All the characters are made up, but are likely based on imagining who did what. The sister-in-law has gone to her ancestral village. These are fleshing out details about the character, giving you a sense for what the kinship might have been, how people live together, work together. And all those details might also come from the way the houses are built. And if you look at the research papers, detailed evidence of, how the house is built, what are the rooms, what uses they were likely put to. So you can see just from these two paragraphs that the fictional enemy, waking up on an early winter's day, there's a clear view of this height. Wispy mist, Choya rivulet, wheat fields, sounds very poetic, sounds very beautiful. And we look at what the language of the research and the research paper is and how this is quite different, connected, and then how making up some details actually doesn't take away from the truth of the research, but makes the research available to readers in a way that they feel like they want to go ahead and read, and not like, someone said earlier that unless I have to read it, I won't read it, right? But here you probably feel like, then what happened? What did she do next, right? So I'm going to stop sharing this screen, this truth versus tale. How should we understand it and how should we understand its work? So what I've done is I've given you a screenshot of another research paper Indoor Khera revisited, excavation of upper site, upper Ganges, and look at all the people. It's not Jaya alone. I mean, archaeologists usually work in groups because nobody can do the excavation alone. There's crediting of everybody there. And look at how Indoor Khera is described. The site of Indoor Khera, then latitude, longitude, is located in Tehsil Dabai, district Bulandshahr, Uttar Pradesh, on the right bank, eastern branch. There is the Choya Nadi, also called the Neem Nadi. Indoor Khera lies between the rivers Kali Nadi and Ganga, figure 1. And we saw how the description was in that very first paragraph, right? So the details are not wrong, right? The details have been all kept, but notice the language in which and the details that are expected in a research paper, but in saying the same thing, in locating it in exactly the same place, when Jaya writes the story, it becomes very different, right? Waking up early, clear, there's this height, all that latitude, longitude has been indicated that, oh, it's at a certain height. Then there's the Choya rivulet and, you know, all of that. So you have all those details, but when you're writing fiction, you don't quite have to write it in that language. And so that's something that I wanted you to pay attention to, is that which portion of the research gets translated how into the fiction. What do you say true to? What are you able to flesh out imaginatively in order to support it? Not in order to make it untrue, but in order that that may become, you know, interesting to read in a different genre. So then my question is, so when we are setting up a story, and we read the first paragraph, in setting up a story, which parts are made up, and what do the fictional parts add to the non-fiction facts about Indoor Khera? So clearly that first paragraph gave you some information about Indoor Khera in a certain kind of way in the research paper. But in this fictionalized, reimagined version of Indoor Khera, what are we getting? So when we set up a story, what do we need, which is missing from that research paper and has got added imaginatively to this? May I have a couple of responses? You can question, setting up a story. So fiction, it's very, very important. The setup is very, very important.
Yes.
So what do fictional parts add to the non-fiction facts about Indoor Khera here? So someone said
characters and the setting and
yes,
the
what in the setting? What in the
so the conflict, I think, of the character is the thing that is going to be proved. Is that how it's going to go?
What can you be more specific? What do you mean by conflict of the character?
What is this hill?
What
is this hill on which our village is located? That's the conflict. That's the question. So that could be the premise, perhaps, or you know, the
why
theme.
This hill? So there's a question. Why this hill? And is there an answer suggested in the paragraph itself?
Yes, there is.
Yes.
Village elders.
What is it?
The village elders say that there was, you know, a community of potters, and then there was an earthquake which turned everything upside down.
Yes.
And subsequently, you know, people find a lot of things. Children find a lot of artifacts and metal when they dig up.
In fact, I remember Jaya telling me that, you know, I was like, okay, how do archaeologists know where to dig? Right, and you all found Harappan sites and of course since then Harappan sites have been found even to the south of the Deccan. So it's really about how old the sites are, right? She said one of the things that happens is that in a flood or an earthquake or whatever, you know, artifacts will just get thrown to the surface. People will find things and we'll hear about it and we'll go and see and we figure that, oh, okay, this is one of the sites that may likely have something that will be useful for us, right? So why this hill? So that's a very clever way. So here, person doesn't understand. She's like, we keep finding these things and coins. We don't use these coins, but we could melt it and make it jewelry, right? So there is, you know, so this person doesn't give the explanation Jaya gave, right? But the fact that this is an old archaeological site is indicated. She doesn't say anything here, but it's indicated by the details. So fiction, one of the things is that in a research paper, it is your job to explain every detail, to document everything, and they make tables and they make folders and they make like, everything is, 14 items that are misshapen. That level of detail you have in their tables, right? Here, it's this young woman who's like, I don't get what this is. But people who know, people who come to this story would realize that these are basically the archaeological finds at the excavation, of which those tables are evidence, right? Or what is documentation? Documentation is like something that is just found and I don't know what this means. Yes, please go ahead. Finding something, not knowing something, intrigue, question, pulling up from the past. There's a sense of time. And very importantly, there's a sense of location. Would you agree that there is a very clear sense of location?
Please.
Between the text and the photograph, the name of the place, elevation of the hill, 2000, the ancient times. Of course, in the explanation, you have 2000, 3000, 5 years. But here it's like, old times. Isn't that how people talk about time and place? Bahut pehle ki baat hai, purani baat hai. Ancestors, right? Purane zamane ki baat hai. Ye mil raha hai. We don't know what this is, but looks old, right? So there's a sense of location and there is also a sense of time. Right?
Yes.
So recalling.
Ananya, in the chat we have a few points. Lavika says drama and conversational, and Anita ma'am says imagery, the descriptive aspect.
Very good. Conversation. And my intervention here would be, I'm going to first write all of this down because these are very important observations you all are making, is that yes, absolutely. So there's conversation, description, there's a sense of drama. What are these? Why do I have to live on top of this hill? It's so much work for me to go down, do this. There's a sense of time, past time, present time. There's a sense and the drama that comes from it. So why is this important? What happened here, right? Conversation between people, old people who live there, and this person who also is having a mental conversation in her head. This description.
And there are certain events that the daily chores have come, so there is a purpose. There's a, it's very beautifully, I have to do this, then I have to go here, and then, there is a flow.
Yes, very good. And all of this I will have a chance to return to. These are important elements of writing. The only intervention I will make here, and I'll say this, there is a way in which research writing also requires it. If you look at the research papers, you will see there is a very detailed sense for time, right? There's a very detailed sense for conversation. And here the conversation is between scholars. Who has done what kind of scholarship to explain what the questions are, what these artifacts are, what is the big bibliography at the end, right? The big bibliography in the end is basically a conversation between scholars about how to put this material together, right? Detailed description in forms of tables. The form of the description changes, the form of the conversation changes, but it's there, right? It's there. So in fiction, when we do it in a different way. So it's not like these elements go away from research writing. They are there in a different form. And in fiction, it changes form and all these elements are there. So using that, I'm going to move ahead.
Right? I wanted to make one point.
Yes.
That in where you're writing down with the part which is non-fictional, you're mostly following text features. And when you're fictionalizing it, you're using text structures where there's cause and effect, problem, solution, chronology, description.
I would say that these are features of both kinds of writing.
Both, sure.
Except that they're done differently, right?
Right.
And different kinds of attentions. For example, in the fictional story, Jaya can get away by saying, oh, old men said there's something ancient. But in the research paper, they do carbon dating to make sure that the time that they're fixing on something is precise. Right? So it's not like these concerns change, but the form in which you're allowed to do it between different genres change. And it's more fun that way. It's like, think about the ways in which we tell. So, once upon a time, long ago. Nobody is asking, was that 100 years, 200 years, 800 years? But here they have to be really, really precise. As I said, they will use, laboratory methods to get to the precise dating of certain objects. They're not going to play fast and loose about when that object appeared. Otherwise, how do they know it's a Harappan site, right? So I would say that it's a very important point that these elements, and which is why I'm doing this workshop, because people tend to think that, you know, research kind of writing, academic writing and creative writing like poetry and fiction are so different from each other. My argument is that they are different. They are generically different. Their use is different, but the elements they are working with is the same. And if done well, both should read well and both should be enjoyable to both write and read, right? Okay. So once again, this is a point we've made already, so I'm not going to stick here too long, but this is from this research paper, Reading Archaeological Evidence, Ceramic and Terracotta Production. I shared this PDF with you also. And look at also how the titles are. A Home on the Hill versus Reading Archaeological Evidence, Ceramic and Terracotta Production, right? And this is the article where they get into the details of, you know, how the clay is made, how the clay is pounded, what were the techniques available to shape the clay into various kinds of pottery, blah, 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 right? And I've highlighted just one. I mean, in the beginning of that paragraph, you see how the clay is made, what is pounded out of it, how it is sifted. The second part, lumps of clay are prepared to be formed into vessels. Vessels forming itself can be done without the wheel, which then involves techniques such as pinching, coiling or slab building. The first is the simplest clay working procedure and is usually used for making small vessels. The clay lump held in the palm, rotated between the fingers, very technically explained what those techniques are, right? So this is in the research paper. And I want to quickly remind us that, remember, this is what is the material. And this last point here, that this technique is probably the earliest known and one by which children begin to experiment and play with clay, right? So they begin to extend their argument that these things might be what children are doing. And remember, this other article is entirely about, you know, children and their work and, you know, why these vessels might be something that children are making. So the second article is entirely about that. And now I want to just bring you to this bit in the short story. May I request one of the students to read out this short paragraph, please?
When I spare the time to look around at the kids, I find that one has rolled a piece of clay on the ground with his fingers. I ask him what it is, to which he replies, nothing, just a snake. I see him cut off a bit of the snake and pinch the ends to make a rolling pin. He carefully rolls up the remainder of the snake to make little balls. He looks very happy with his little piece of laddus. Little pile of laddus. His sister has patted the clay into a flat circular shape and has now put a little finger in it to curve it into a bowl. She ceremoniously shows me her first bowl, which I pretend to assess with great care. It is clearly misshapen. Its walls are not even, and when made to stand on the ground, it kneels over. But she made it, and she is proud of it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Myra. Myra, may I ask you to now, again, that question I asked earlier, which bits of this come from the research and which bits of this add the fictional story element?
So probably the entire process of making the bowl
Yes.
seems like it could be from research, and the fact that the kids are making it uses the bowls, as previously mentioned. But I think how you know, the way she's she doesn't really know if it's the boy's sister or
No, wait, hold on. Pay attention to the text, Myra. Look at the sentences highlighted in blue. Which portions? So you're right that, you know, the actual technique of making these things and the bowl and everything, children making it, comes from the research, right? But what are the parts that are added to the research to make it into a kahani?
The entire dialogue about.
Yes. And what are the dialogues about?
When he says it's a snake, it probably wasn't a snake. It was just a piece.
Or could have been, right? So she makes it up. Yeah. What about the other one?
I think, and but she made it and she's proud of it. I think she probably might have been proud of it, but again, we can't really.
Right. So in the research, you can only say children made it. Here, the relationship between the children is formed. And remember we said, oh, she seems like a very harried, young, busy mother who's looking after the household, who's looking after children, who's looking after and she has certain duties towards the pottery making as well. And it begins when I spare the time to look around at the kids. She's been busy. So I spare the time, I look at the kids, and what does she find? She finds her, one has rolled a piece of clay. One little boy is like playing. He said, what are you doing? This is like a regular conversation at home, right? With Play-Doh. Kids will play with Play-Doh, and if you ask them, kya bana hai, they'll say something, right? So what Jaya has done is cast it into that mold. The children are playing. So the research papers claim that these are vessels made by children. Here there's a human element. So mom is looking at the kids and saying, kya bana hai? And the kid is like, kuch nahi, saap hai. And then breaks it up, makes it into little laddus and keeps it in a pile. Now the research paper doesn't have any of that, but the research paper does document all these items that were found in the excavation, right? But that this is a pile of laddus or a snake. And then the sister who's older has actually made a little bowl out of it. And the picture is there and the centimeter measure is there. And the mother is like, and mothers will do that. If kids have made something, they'll say, it's very nice, it's very nice, even though it is clearly misshapen. And why Jaya needs to emphasize this is because that's what they found. And that's the argument that they've made. But notice how putting it like this gives it a very human element. There are relationships, there are people, and this fleshes out all the findings of the research work, right? So this is, again, I just wanted to you to pay a little attention to that. So by now we can claim that if we have to tell a fictional story, there are some elements, and this actually is a condensed version of the points that all of you already made earlier on, right? So what are the basic elements of telling a story? And there are many more things, and I'm sure Vatsala ma'am has taught you several other more complex things that go on, but if you boil it down, these are some basic elements of storytelling. What are they? This place and time, right? And we saw, that Indoor Khera is the place, location, hill, there's a river, a solid sense of where you are, right? That's very important. A sense of time, and a sense of time may be, depending on the skill of the storyteller, maybe, it is only 2022, this day, Saturday, or it could be one that's shifting between many times, past, present. In this story, you have people talking about ancient times, ancient coins. So there's a switching between back and forth of time, but there's a sense of time, a very clear sense of time. Characters, right? Stories will take characters to whom, the events who will participate in action, activities. Someone said earlier on that there are activities that are both mundane. You're cooking, you're making chutney, you're shopping at your friend's house, but you're also doing important work which may be dramatic. There may be dramatic events and actions, and we look at that example. And finally, a plot that is made up of those actions. Plot where things happen, events happen, something happens, activity takes place in time, right? And it may be very dramatic, it may be mundane, it may be a combination of both. And we get a sense of that in Jaya's story as well. May I have a student read out the very first sentence highlighted in yellow, and then the last sentence highlighted in blue?
It sounds like the children are awake. I call out to them to wash up before they eat. They know they have to help me with bringing the vessels out for firing. Should I continue on?
Yeah.
I should read the blue highlighted part.
Yes.
It is my task to arrange the vessels in the pit kiln for firing. This is not an easy thing to do. I remember the first time my mother-in-law left me to arrange the vessels by myself, and most of the pots came out cracked. What a disaster it was. I ran away to the temple and hid there till sundown, when my husband found me and cajoled me to come home. It was a long time before I was allowed near the kiln again.
Thank you so much. Pratishtha or anybody else who would like to respond, what's the difference between the activity or the action in the sentence in yellow, where she's waking up her children and saying, "Uth jao, wash up, khana khao, eat," You have to help me today with the vessels that have to be taken for firing. And between the second anecdote highlighted in blue that she narrates, where she talks about, this is a very difficult task. To arrange the pot in the tin is a very, very important and difficult task. And if you get it wrong, it's a disaster, because it means all the work that you did is spoiled and you can't sell it and make money for your pots. Pots are going to actually crack in the tin. And then she describes how when she was young and she had just come to this house and learned to do this, she got it wrong. And most of the pots broke, which meant the labor of the entire family over several days is wasted. It can't go to the market and make money. And it's a disaster. So she actually runs away from the house and hides in the temple. And her husband has to come and say, come back, whatever. She's very scared of what will happen. And then she says, it was a long time before I was allowed to do that work again. So my question, what's the difference between this activity of waking up children, feeding them, telling them, let's go start the day, and this other story, which is also activity and action? What's the difference? Tanmay.
Yeah, ma'am. So I felt that the children are awake. The yellow line shows that like lady has been used to this activity for many years, and she's like fine with it, and it's not that like personally engaging for her. However, the blue line shows an experience which she like felt personally and which she was like scared to feel. Also, it was like at the start of her marriage, so it may be more emotionally draining to her than the first experience.
Thank you. Any other response, Alisha?
So I felt like the first line was very assertive. It was like command and it was really fast paced, I feel. And then the ending was very reflective. And the sentences are also like, I feel like they're a little longer than how the paragraph started off.
Sure. Very good observation. But what's the obvious thing? What's the most obvious thing about the kind of action? Remember, we're talking about plot and action and what kinds of action we can have in a story. In a story, do characters constantly only do crisis situation things, or are they doing other activities also?
So mundane recurring chores.
Yes.
Yes. And then there's a flashback, which is anecdotal.
Which is anecdotal about a chore which became crisis.
Crisis, yes.
Right? So in fiction, so I want to draw your attention to this, that when we are writing a story, and of course, I don't want to make a generalization about this and say that, oh, it only has to be like this. But this is for people starting out, this is a good strategy. To remember that in a story, a character will do ordinary day-to-day things like eat, brush your teeth, stop at your friend's house, wake up your children, right? These are mundane activities that you do, all characters need to do. And then there are activities that led to crisis, that drama happened, that was a problem, there had to be a resolution, right? So the pace of the story, and I enjoyed the observation Alisha made, that there is a difference in pacing, right? And when you're reflecting and thinking back, the sentences are longer. But when you're waking up your children, you're like, Arey utho, come on, chop, chop, right? So the sentences, the writing of the sentences reflect, that's a very, very good observation, right? But the main point I wanted to make here is that place and time, characters, and you name them, you give them a personality, you give them an age, you give them relationships with. So she's one kind of mother. You can tell what her personality is by the various details that are given about her. And then you also incorporate sort of stories about the past, or crisis can happen in future, past, whenever, but some kind of an action that is both mundane but is also dramatic. And we see all these features in the story that we read. So can we agree?
Jaya is fleshing out the characters very well to integrate the non-fictional aspects and to make them palatable.
Wonderful. So the non-fictional aspects, seems so easy, seems so natural, seems so probable and possible, right? That all these techniques that are being described seem like, yeah, that's what kids would do if they were given Play-Doh, right? Or if you caused a major crisis in the family, what helps the family get employment, that you would get scared and run away, and then you're cajoled back. All that adds a lot of emotional depth to the story. So it's a great point that all these elements from the research, are integrated into the storytelling in a way that it doesn't seem like an external thing. It seems like that's what would happen in the day-to-day lives of people, right? So keeping this in mind, this is now the second part of the workshop. So first of all, I want to thank the students who feature in this and who have made this video. What is the objective? I'm going to play, this is a 3-minute clip. I'm going to play it once. I'll be silent. And then I'll play it again because this is your task now. So I said you need to have something to write with. You're going to mine this clip for details, the kind of details we saw in Jaya's research paper, right? And then we're going to try and write a little story around it, right? Yes.
The state of Rajasthan in India has a body of myth and stories that are transmitted orally from one generation to the other through a kavadia using a cover, which is a portable shrine. These oral traditions serve as a medium for evolving, storing, and then transferring knowledge, art, and ideas from one generation to the other. The Kavar tradition is approximately 400 years old, although, like several oral traditions in India, its origin is associated with mythology. Stories from the Rig Veda, such as Mahabharata, epics such as Mahabharata and Ramayana, are told along with stories from folk traditions. Since early times, they have been recited on both religious and secular occasions.
Most cultural expressions survive in India because of a strong sense of identity and pride. The practitioners have in their ancestral heritage. There are 3 main communities involved in the tradition. First is the Suttar community that makes these colorful wooden boxes or covers. Second is the Kavaria Bhatt, who uses it to tell stories. And the third is the Jajman or patrons who commission as well as consume these stories. The Suttar community almost exclusively makes covers. It is a carpenter community that mostly lives in a village of Basi on Chittor Kota Road in Mewar region of Rajasthan.
The first stage of making the cover is setting the wooden frame, which has almost 12 to 16 panels on wooden pivots and metal hinges. They are made from soft neem wood or the wood of mango tree. These are further processed and painted using natural dye. Also, the carver artists use colors derived from minerals. These mineral colors are in the form of powders which are mixed with a solution of tree resin, which acts as an adhesive. The color palette used by the artist is composed by white, red, blue, yellow, green, and black.
Once the mineral colors are prepared and the wooden structure is given its base color, the artist makes the outline of the figure using a fine brush. The original cover was always on a red background. Nowadays, covers are made to suit a variety of tastes and functions and are made in a range of colors. The colors are applied one by one in layers, each layer adding the next stage of depth and detailing.
The tradition of Kavar Bhatts begins with the introduction of the Kavadia, the storyteller. He introduces himself and his village. He also explains what the story is going to present. The Kavadia squats on the ground, holding the cover in his lap, lights the incense sticks, says the small prayer, and then begins the narration by pointing at the images on the cover with a peacock feather or sometimes directly with his finger. As the stories are told, the panels are opened one after the other.
The storyteller gives an overview of the story on the panel, introducing all the characters. After making the general introduction, he returns to each image and tells the story in detail. As several stories are associated with the same character, he may use the same image to tell a different story each time. Also, there is a tiny drawer at the bottom where the viewers are expected to drop the coins towards the storyteller as his fee at the end. The devotees offer food, flowers, and gifts and are blessed in return.
Today, Kavar storytelling is known to stand on the brink of extinction. Only a dozen craftsmen are known to be making Kavar, and a few Kavaria Bhatts are said to be walking in the rustic bylanes of Rajasthan.
We are going to now try and write a story with these research information that we've got, just like we saw in Jaya's paper. How do we now make a story out of this? So what I'm going to do now is you have some notes already. And so what do we need? We agreed that to have a story, we need place, time, characters. I'm going to take us through an exercise which helps us generate some details about this. The putting together of that, Kanika, you will have to take care of. I will give you one example of putting it together, but how that is put together, either with the help of only this example or the research students have done in their own groups, you can choose to do that. So that's, I hope that that helps you take this exercise forward. So for the rest of you now, students and faculty, you took down some details. We agreed that we need to have place, time, character, plot, action, in order to begin to have the material with which to create a fictional fleshing out of many interesting details that we noticed in this video essay. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to ask you a set of questions related to each of these categories, and in your notebook or wherever you're writing, you write those answers down, right? So this is to encourage you to flesh out details which may or may not make it to the story, but will give you room to think, I hope, right? Okay, so my very first question, and please write answers to this in your notebook, is going to be about time and place. So now imagination galore, based of course on the notes that you took and the video that you saw. What is the name of the place your story is set? You can imagine this, or it can be a real place in Rajasthan, up to you. What is the name of the place your story is set? One word answer. Don't agonize over it. You can also always change it when you draft your story. But clearly it helps to have name of a place. What is the larger location of the place? Is it a village? Is it a town? Is it a city? Could be anything, right? Once again, you know, you can always change it, but begin to imagine, where might this be located? Village, town, city, up to you. What year is the story located? If you like, you can also set it in 2 time periods, up to you. But if you had to locate it somewhere, where might it be? Can you think of anything significant that happened that year? Now you can choose to be historically true here, or you can choose to make it up, depends. But some event which might affect the plot of the story. So say something like a drought or a flood or an earthquake or a pandemic which we are living through, anything of a large socio-economic scale that happened at that time. You, as I said, you can be historically true. I mean, depending on the region and the city and the town or the village you've picked. Did something happen around the years or decades that you have picked up? Next, did your protagonist grow up here, or did they move here to earn a living? Imagine one physical feature of this place that might be useful in where the plot unfolds. Now remember, this is a Kavaria storytelling kind of a research work. Depending on whose point of view you're telling the story from, you know, a house might be helpful, or a town square, or a theater, right? Some place where it's happening. Can you imagine that? And note that down, and you can flesh it out later. A place where all of this might, a place that's significant to the telling of the story. And you know, the videos also were showing certain places. You can stick to that. You can imagine something else, up to you. Character. Moving on to character now. What is the name of your main character? Turns out in Jaya's story, the main character didn't have a name, but other people, Shanti had a name, right? Vijay, her brother-in-law later on. So, you know, different writers will do it differently, but imagine a name. You may or may not name the character when you actually write the story, but imagine one. Kuch bhi. Is your character male or female? What is your character's involvement with the art of power, right? Now we notice there are three sets of people who are involved. People who are carpenters and make it are not the ones who tell the story. Then there are the Kavriya Bhatts who actually utilize that to tell the story but are not involved in making it. Then there are audiences, right? So your protagonist, who do you want your protagonist to be? Do you want it to be someone who listens to these stories, grows up listening to these stories? Do you want it to be a person who's telling the story? Do you want it to be the person who makes it? It's up to you. You can even have more than one person involved, but it would be helpful to, right at the beginning, maybe pin it somewhere, right? And all of these things can be changed and revised. How old is your character? Remember, we don't know how old Jaya's character is, but we all figured she's a young mother, not very, very young, but has kids who are sort of growing up. We knew what happened when she was very young and inexperienced, but she's probably like a little younger than a middle-aged person, right? So you get a sense for that. So how old is your character? You may or may not choose to state it, but it helps to know how old this person is, right? Think of a physical feature of this character that is in some way an identifying feature.
Can you give us an example?
Alicia, as simple as a mole on his, cheek, or a twitch in his eye. The moment he starts fumbling his, he has a twitch in his eye that goes like that.
Could be.
And he tries to camouflage it with his expressions. So it turns out to be a winner for him rather than this.
Yeah. So anything, any physical feature, again, you can change it later. So remember, you're trying to flesh out a character, right? Think of a personality feature of this character that gives this character distinct personality. Is this a very angry person? Is this a person who's always making peace in the community, doesn't like conflict? Is this a person who's rebellious, right? Who questions what is around, like this? So there is physical feature. There is also a personality character.
Great. Okay, so we can also do a show not tell, whereby we talk about this person in a way that some trait is culled out.
So right now we are not worrying about that. What we are doing is we are just imagining a person out of thin air.
Right.
And later on, when you actually tell the story, you might not say this is an angry person, but you might show this person banging doors all the time.
Right.
Right. So that's a different. Right now we are just saying, oh, is this an angry person? Is this a peacemaker? Is this a rebellious person? Is this anything? It really doesn't matter what, it's up to you.
Right.
So physical characteristics, personality characteristics, things that go into making people. Now this would be interesting. Think of an event in this person's past, childhood, youth, anytime at all, that this person thinks is important, and this affects this person's choices and behavior. And think about our own lives, right? We have these landmark moments in our lives, which we always say as, yeah, that's what made me who I am today, right? Once I got caught doing something really stupid and got punished in class, or once I had this huge fight with a friend, or once my mother said this to me and I haven't forgotten till date. All kinds of things that seem to be an important event in the past. Again, imagine what it is, you can change it later, helps you build a character, and it may or may not appear in the story, but having that background helps when you start writing the story. Good. So right now, just some bullet points. You'll flesh it out when Kanika gets you to do the homework. Plot and action, right? So that's the third thing. Think of a problem or a crisis your character has to deal with. And I've given an example. It can be anything, really. So for example, one of the things that the video tells us is that, this is a dying art. There are maybe a couple of dozen Kavriya Bhatts left who are walking around telling the story anymore. So part of the problem might be a crisis that the character might, that you're discussing in the story is one of not finding audience, right? People are not interested anymore. So that's a crisis, that's a problem. Or for example, being a woman wanting to be a Kavriya Bhatt. In the video, I didn't say a single woman actually. So I'm assuming that, and given that this is Rajasthan, that this is not an art that was passed down to daughters. And if I'm imagining Kavaria Bhatt's daughter saying, I want to do this, and this is not unusual. This happens a lot of time with a lot of arts where daughters want to do it and are not allowed. So say that is the crisis I imagine, that there is a woman not being allowed to do it. That's also might be the plot, the crisis that I want to pitch my story around. So I've given you 2 examples. It can be anything you like. Now we said activities or actions in the stories are a combination of mundane activities and crisis. Everything can't be crisis mode. There are some ordinary day-to-day things also that people do. So depending on who your protagonist is, if your protagonist is a carpenter of the Suthar community making the tower, then what are they doing in break time? Or what time in the morning do they start work? But while they are doing that, do they also listen to the radio? Little details, little activities. What are some special talents and skills your protagonist has and is good at doing pertaining to those details, right? So is this someone who's really good at understanding quality of wood, right? Or someone who can really get a sense into the listeners, can really captivate audience, something, anything pertaining to the protagonist that you have chosen. And here's the important one. So you picked up a crisis, you picked up a problem. And I'm not suggesting that all fictional stories always end up in crisis resolution and happy endings. They don't, we know that. But assuming, so this is one form of the story, assuming that this can have a resolution. So there's a problem. So if the problem is that here's a cover who's not finding audience and is not being able to make ends meet, then ends up meeting a school principal somewhere, and the school principal says, no, we must teach our students this, and gives this person a job as a crafts teacher in a school, who's then able to teach school students this art, solves the problem, right? So the plot would have to go in a way that there's despair, and then there is a way in which it's solved in a way that it works out. And you can have a sad ending, you can have a happy ending, but think about the resolution in the way that it works or doesn't, right? Or say, for example, if your protagonist is that woman wanting to be a cover, not being allowed, manages, however, to become a coward, depending on however the life story pans out, right? So that's a solution to the crisis that you picked up. Depending on the crisis, find a solution that is probable and possible, right? So in Jaya's story, protagonist does become very good at arranging pots in the kiln. And in fact, the story ends on that note, that not only are all the pots fine, but they get sold in the market, and the family is going to be prosperous for having that economic circle of art and market sort of meet in a nice way, right? So this is it. So what I'm going to do now is give you just a couple of minutes, 2-3 minutes, to go over your these notes that you've taken and reflect on it. And then I'll invite some responses about the, and you look at the details, a kind of story will begin to suggest itself. So take 2-3 minutes, I will shut up and take a few minutes, just reflect on all the notes and see the kind of story that's emerging. So I'll give you that time now, and I'll keep quiet. Okay. So may I have some volunteers tell me about what kind of story they see emerging from the notes they have taken. Obviously, this is not fully done, but something about a character may have grabbed your imagination, or maybe a plot line, or some detail is making you feel like, हाँ, इसका कुछ कर सकते हैं. The story can be told around this. I'd like to hear about that. So I know you've not yet written the story, but has some detail caught you in a way that you want to push it and see how it can be made into a story, explore it more in a story? So may I have some volunteers speak to me about that, and then I will share with you the story that I wrote. So stories can be long or short. Stories can be 500 words or 5,000 words. Because of this workshop and its length, what I did was I wrote a small thing, and small stories are called flash fiction. And flash fiction can be 300 words also. So Kanika, if you want students to work with the flash fiction length, that's fine. If there is more time and students want to flesh more of those details out, you can give them a longer word limit. But for the moment, let's think about it like that as a short piece. And now I invite you to share with me your observations about what has emerged in your notes. Alicia?
I don't know how good my story is, but I was thinking of basically a girl who's in college, who's majoring in literature and is conflicted about moving to business management or business studies. And then she goes on a holiday to this place called Kavarpur in Rajasthan. And there she meets in the market a person who is who hand makes covers. And he's the only one in town left who does it in a handmade fashion. Everyone else is making them in machines. And I was thinking of how basically she is a workaholic and she doesn't like wasting time even on her holidays. So she goes with this guy or girl who is hand making these and finds a solution for him or her to beat, the machine made covers and become famous or something.
And it sounds to me like it will be a great bridge between her interest in literature and stories.
Yeah, and then at the end,
wonderful, so good. I can see a really lovely story emerging out of the details of that research. They're lovely. I see Pratishta's hand up.
Yes, I don't think my story is like that good.
But your story like that. Don't preface your story with "I don't think it's good." Preface your story with "Here's what I have."
Yes, so here's what I have is basically a girl who was born outside of India, who was born in UK and is coming back to India for about a month to reconnect with her roots, or what she calls her parents' roots. And in that way, she during that trip, she lands up in Rajasthan, ends up learning about it, and settles down here only and embraces this tradition as her profession, or new profession, basically.
Okay, so you've actually chosen someone who is going to be the audience. So both of you actually choose protagonists who are the judgment, the audience of it. And that's very interesting. Very good. Shania?
Yeah, so my story is based in Basi village itself, and the in present times, and the protagonist is a girl about 11 or 12 years of age who's grown up there, and is the daughter of the carpenter of the sister who makes the covers. The issue I focused on is actually the pandemic. Okay. So the art of cover, from what I understood, it's almost a dying art. So I wanted to focus on that. And what is a very interactive process. It's an interactive process, which would sort of unite communities and form a bond. So this girl, she's grown up, helping her father make these covers. I can mention the non-fiction details here, like how the powder and the tree resin was combined to make colors. Her favorite process. Her favorite part was actually painting with her father. And then how she used to, as a physical feature, I mean, I'm not sure that's a physical feature, but just to focus on how she was young, innocent, full of curiosity, and wonder, her being barefoot.
Being barefoot around a carpentry workshop is dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, no, running to the town square to hear the actual story come to life.
That's an eccentric little detail that should always run around barefoot. And there are nails and carpentry workshop, that's not safe to do.
Yeah, along with that, just the part of the town is a town square where everyone will gather to hear the stories, and she would love to see this father made come to life. So she would run barefoot to the town square, always excited to hear the stories. And here again, non-fiction details about how the panels, how the Kavarias would light incense candles, recite a prayer and start the process, so stuff like that. And then because of the pandemic, this stopped. So I haven't really developed the later part of it, but this is basically the story.
This is just to get a taste for whether you feel like the juices are flowing and you can start working on it or not. And this sounds really, really good. May I have Alicia N?
Yes, so this is a really old tradition, right? And it's about 400 years old according to my notes. But the thing that really struck me was that it's the same pictures, using the same pictures to tell different stories.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Right? So I would like my protagonist to be the storyteller or the Kabar Bhatt, and how his story changes over time based on perhaps his experiences, what all he sees, right from his maybe his crisis is what he feels about mythology or the epics, the Rig Veda, something about that. So I really
that's great. That's great. So this idea that the same image can tell different stories, and maybe can tell stories that are both mythological, but also maybe something current and social, that you may be able to work something around that.
I want to begin the story with the crisis, right? Because it's a 400-year-old tradition, and I want to, my place is a small town, wherein during the month of August, the Kailash Mela, right? This handful of cowards, they actually roam around the entire city barefooted. They start the journey at night carrying the cowards. So there is a little history there, right? And so my protagonist, he's of course, I've already thought of a name, Somnath Bhatt and Vignesh Bhatt, his son, right? So he's this father, the storyteller. He is actually yearning to continue with the tradition, but most of his sons have left for greener pastures and different profession. His youngest son is there with him. And because I want to begin with the crisis, usually on such a day, the traffic is curtailed and professionals find it very difficult to be, yes. And often there is a clash between the mob, the police, the people traveling on different vehicles, and these handful of Shiv Bhakts, cowards, right? So the story begins from there, and there is an injury, and then we have a reporter coming in, and then the whole
story unfolding.
Yes.
Wonderful. That sounds like a lovely plotting that I would really enjoy reading that.
Thank you.
Pritha?
Yeah, mine is a story set in a village in Rajasthan around the mid-19th century, wherein the protagonist, the lady, she's a widow and she has come back to her father's place, and naturally her people at home are not very happy because they are the narrators. I mean, they don't earn very well, not financially very well off. But she's the one who used to assist her father in narrating the story, would go to the villages, and she's a natural storyteller and also has a mellifluous voice. And she was widowed at the age of 17 with a 1-year-old daughter, and that daughter is 5-year-old now, and she wants to continue with the tradition. And through her stories, she wants to teach back in mid-19th century how it is very important to empower women as well.
Thank you. In fact, Pritha, that is a very, very good segue into the tiny flash fiction that I wrote. Yeah. And to read this, may I actually request...
Ananya, just Vanita ma'am had a question. So before we proceed, may we take her question, please?
Yeah, that's a very quick question. But my question is that because we are talking about an art form which is gradually diminishing or like going to be extinct, is it necessary that we glorify this art? Because I want a protagonist who is at this crossroad where he feels he's 50 something and he feels that I always wanted to do something else. I was forced into the profession because this was my family's profession.
Yes, absolutely. So what is your goal here?
What I want to do, I have to glorify that this is...
That's what I'm responding to. So what is the goal of this exercise? The goal of this exercise is a bunch of research that's being done, and we know certain details. about the craft, about its practitioners, about its history. Now, how you cast to tell it? You want to tell that from the point of view of a disappointed practitioner who doesn't want to do it anymore, but you got all the details and fine. That's a story. That's a tragic story. Doesn't have to be one where like, oh, I loved it and I want to continue it, right? So in fact, you will see an element of that in the quick flash fiction example that I wrote as I prepared this. And to read this, I would actually request the two narrators of the video. Tanmay, I think, was one, and Saisha, I think, was the other. Tanmay and Saisha, may I request? And you did such a good job of narrating the video sequentially. May I request you to do that with this story also?
Sure, ma'am.
So Saisha can read the first, Tanmay the second, Saisha again the last.
A red painted box. The year my father died, I inherited a red painted box. It was no ordinary box. It was made of soft neem wood and panels that opened up with stories illustrated from the Mahabharata. My favorite one was where Draupadi refuses to let herself be disrobed in the court of Kauravas after her 5 husbands lost her honor in a gambling match. This box, called a cupboard, a portable shrine, has drawers at the bottom to collect offerings from listeners and devotees, coins and rupee notes after the storytelling. This would keep the kitchen fires burning in our small village house in the outskirts of Chittorgarh in Rajasthan. It was my job to empty the drawers of the money and hand it to my mother. Kharki Lakshmi, my father called me.
I call this box my inheritance, but my father didn't want me to have it. It is not for girls to roam the bylanes of towns telling stories and collecting money, was my father's refrain to me. The Kavar Bhatts are always boys, but my older brothers wanted no part of it. There is no future in this art. My older brother would say to my father every time, tried to pass on the skills and knowledge of Kavar storytelling to them. And I, Lakshmi, the youngest child, a girl, would listen keenly and learn up all the stories he tried to teach them. What a beautiful singing voice she has, too. I heard my father say ruefully to my mother when he heard me sing out the songs etched on the cover. As I went about doing the chores deemed more appropriate for a girl.
Then the COVID pandemic hit. My father got sick and died. My brothers, who had left to work in Delhi, couldn't travel back to the village for the funeral ceremony. It was me and my mother and our neighbors. How does one respectfully send off an age-old Kawat Bhatt as his ancestors before him? With the Kawat story telling, of course, it came to me, this red painted box, my inheritance after all. I picked the story about Bhishma lying on his bed of arrows, telling who would hear how he might be put to death and rest.
Thank you so much. All right. So that was basically what I made of the research that I saw in that video essay in the form of fiction. I have already shared this PowerPoint with Kanika. Take a look at it again. I know we are short on time. We are actually at time now. And I'd like to end this workshop to hear what you thought of that piece of fiction in terms of all the details and all the questions and how we might do it and narrative and details, all of that. And come back to the point that we began with. How do we make head or tail of research, right? We can make head or tail of research with video documentaries, video essays, research papers, but we can make further head and tail of it, head and tail of it, by also, producing works of fiction around it, which has an emotional quality that research papers can't necessarily have, right? So my question to you is, so what do you think then is the relationship between truth and tales, right? They're supposed to be on the opposite side of the spectrum, but are they really when we approach it like this? So I'll take any responses, questions you may have. I will stop sharing, and I would like to hear from Saisha and Tanmay whether they think their research work was done justice to in the story that I wrote.
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. It was our honor to read it, and we're thankful you found it worthy of weaving a story out of it. Thank you, ma'am.
Any particular details you thought might have pushed it, or you thought was adequate in fleshing out your research? I'd be happy to take that as well. Yeah, go ahead.
The element of bringing the Mahabharata into it, I found it was very interesting.
And it came from research. You all said that those are the painted panels. They often have stories from Mahabharata. Tanmay?
Yeah, and mom, we both also like mythology, and many children do not know much about mythology in today's age. So, I mean, it was really interesting to see the Draupadi and Bhishma reference.
So now I'm done with my part of the presentation. Happy to take any comments. And it's 4:35. Don't want to keep you for any longer than you are meant to be here. So I'll leave it up to you. Kanika, is it clear what the next assignment might be then?
Yeah. Yes, and I think it's very beneficial because I just want to share that I had shared with you, I think, that they've gone on to doing the short stories by Manto. And so, in fact, all the steps that you took them through with regard to how to actually create all of the narrator, the perspective, who's the protagonist. I was just thinking that, I'd love to do a session with my kids where I pick up those questions and ask the same thing in terms of Manto. I mean, he was writing for papers, right? And so he would have been in those situations, but he didn't take them as a reporter, but instead a storyteller.
Right, and it's a very good analogy. So journalists are also constantly encountering stories, and they have the option of writing it as a report for the newspaper, or as a story, as Manto did, and many other journalists also do.
Yeah, Shania, you had raised your hand.
Yeah, it was just about what you were saying about Manto, as well as the questions Mom had put on the PPT. So, I mean, research does sound like the foundation of what we know, but I mean, all tales are inspired by research. I mean, and by truth.
So that's the answer to the question I was asking, right? So what's the relationship between research work and telling tales? Research tells tales too. In fact, if you read Jaya's paper, there is a narrative, there is a conversation, there is new stuff as well. Again, as I said, these are done a little differently, right? So thank you for that, Shania. Anybody else has any observations or comments?
So, ma'am, I'd just like to say that I think I speak for everyone when I say that this was a very interactive session. I'm sure the students really enjoyed it, and it was also so well scaffolded. So many questions for how to build detail into your writing. Really enjoyed that. I'm looking forward to exploring more of these topics. Okay, so thank you so much, ma'am. Absolutely wonderful having you here. And Shantan and Neha. And Shantan has also designed that poster, and I did not miss that the head was a fish head and the tail was a fish. Absolutely lovely poster. And all the participants, all our students and our dear teachers who have been here with us, thank you so much for making this a fruitful session. And Kanika has been spearheading this from day one. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a big team effort with a lot of different stakeholders, and a special thank you to you and Arpan for actually, being open to this idea and taking it from, our first bit to the second bit.
We love a good challenge.
Thank you so much. Indebted, absolutely.